Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be taking a look at a MetaNite list from the 2006 Worlds format. Now, typically when I showcase decks, I've always got my own twist on them, my own list for them. But today, I am going to be showing card for card Yuta Komatsuta's top 4 Worlds list. Now, I think there's some different ways you can tech this. I think there's a few different ways you can build this. But his core concept and his core list were just so absolutely fantastic that I wanted to highlight his list in particular and then talk about it from there instead of throwing my own variation of it in. And I think one of the things that really impresses me about this list is at the time, a lot of the really smart innovations with this, I think went over my head because so many people in the 2006 format were so focused on building these Delta decks around Holen's cast form and the Holen engine. And Yuta went a different direction and said, I know that's good, but I think I can do a list that's better without using the Holen engine. Now, I think there is two very distinct ways you can play MetaNite in the 2006 format. One is Yuta's variation here, and then a more Holen specific version, which I'm going to cover on the channel at another time. But essentially, the main strategy of the deck is that you are going to be using Metagross from Delta Species just to get a whole bunch of advantage. This is the, I guess, consistency Pokemon for the deck. Some decks will play Pidgeot, some will play Macargo. This is the Pokemon for this deck. And on top of that, it's also your main attacker. So instead of running a side tech line like Pidgeot or Macargo, you're maximizing your odds of not only hitting your main attacker, but also your main consistency engine, which is a major strength of the MetaNite deck. Now, to power up that Crush and Burn attack, we're also going to be using Dragonite from Delta Species and Delta Charge to essentially attach in a Lightning Energy from our discard pile to one of our benched Pokemon. Now, instead of playing the Holen engine, we are going to be using Beldum from Hidden Legends to set up, and combined with that, we're also going to be using Jirachi from Deoxys. But now that we've covered the main concept of the deck, let's just go ahead and jump in to and start talking about some of the individual cards and some of the really smart innovations that Yuta made with this deck. So, starting off here, we played 4 copies of the Magnetic Call Beldum. Now, this is just so incredibly strong. Outside of, for the cast form variation of the deck, you need to have cast form, you need to get in the active spot, you need to get an energy under it, you got to have a big bench of Delta Species Pokemon that you're going to draw from. And with this variation of the deck, you don't. All you need is literally Beldum. As soon as you have a Beldum in play, your setup engine can go into full effect. Now, when you look at this Beldum, in theory, it looks absolutely outstanding. All right, Magnetic Call, flip a coin. If you get heads, you grab another Beldum. All right, flip a coin, get heads again, grab another Beldum. All right, at some point, we're going to grab a Jirachi. When we finally get tails, that's fine. We'll just, instead of having one coin flip next turn, then we've got 3 Beldum in plays. We'll get 3 coin flips, just finish our setup, and go from there. Now, in theory, this is very strong. What you're going to find in reality, though, is you can find yourself in a little bit of a difficult spot if you do end up getting a very early tails on Magnetic Call. Say, for example, you open Beldum, you flip coin, you get tails, and then it just stops right there. Following turn, same thing, flip coin, you get tails. You will find yourself in those awkward spots every now and then. It's one of those things when the engine gets rolling, it feels unbelievably strong, but remember, at times you will get a much slower start from that Magnetic Call because it is on a coin flip. Now, note that Beldum does have a 2 retreat cost, so to offset that, Yuta plays 3 copies of the Levitate Metatang. Now, the idea is his first turn, he's going to go through his Magnetic Calls. Second turn, he's going to go through the Magnetic Calls again. Ideally, have a few Beldums in play, and finally get a Jirachi, evolve the active Beldum to a Metatang, retreat back to the Jirachi, use Wishing Star to set up from there. Now, the thing about the Magnetic Call is you are not able to get anything other than metal Pokemon with it, so you cannot search out the Dratini. But the idea is that you're rushing that Metagross, and then once you have the Metagross, you start using Delta Control. And then from there, that's where you're able to set up your Dragonite lines relatively consistently. Now, the thing about Metagross is it does just a little bit of everything right. It's got a solid 100 hit points. It's got that Lightning type, which can be very useful in this format against Pidgeot and Blastoise EX. It's got that Metal type, so you can use Metal Energy to reduce damage. Delta Control is an outstanding power to help you set up. And something I do want to note on this is since it's the main attacker of the deck, we play 3 copies of it. So unlike one, it's going to be a little bit more consistent to set up than Pidgeot because we're playing essentially a 4-3, 3 copies of this, which is going to be far easier to get out than say like a 2-1-2 Pidgeot. And 2, we're going to get multiple copies of this Metagross in place, so it's not like our opponent can target it down. Like if you're playing against a Pidgeot, for example, LBS could take Steelix and just knock out the Pidgeot, and then they're down the Quick Search. This deck is far harder to pinpoint one Pokemon that's holding everything together because every Pokemon you have in play, both the Metagross and the Dragonite, both they all serve their own little functions, and it would make it really hard to just take out a single Pokemon and just ruin the setup. No, Crush and Burn, outstanding attack. You do have to discard energy for it, but you have basically unlimited damage potential, especially in the later stages of the game. If you're able to build up some energy in play, you're going to be able to be taking one-hit knockouts with relative ease. One Metagross from Deoxys. This serves a couple of different purposes. One, it lets you get a Psychic or Metal Energy out of your discard pile, attach it to your active Pokemon. Essentially, they do take 1 damage counter, but essentially if you're grabbing a Metal Energy, that's going to offset the 1 damage counter. But essentially, it's just another way to get energy in play outside of just Dragonite to get some really large super Crush and Burns off. And then going along with that too, it's also a Psychic type that has that Link Blast attack. That can be useful in certain situations. Say, for example, Lugia EX, for example, you're going to be doing ×2 damage to that. We play a 3-1-3 Dragonite line. Dragonite has a Delta Charge. It can be a situationally decent attacker. Agility if you need to buy yourself a turn. Not very often are you going to find yourself using Heavy Impact, but it does have a couple of nice resistances in there with Grass and Fighting. 2 copies of Jirachi. Yuta knew he didn't have to go heavy with the Jirachi because he's got that Beldum's Magnetic Call. Playing the second copy just means it's very unlikely that he would prize both, but he's not essentially trying to open with the Jirachi. He's just hoping to get it off of the Magnetic Call and free retreat into it from the Meta Tank. For Celio's Network, great for searching out our basics, searching out for evolutions. It can grab absolutely everything in the deck. 2 Copycat. This format can have relatively large hands. Yuta's going to try to take advantage of that by playing Copycat. Format can have relatively large benches, so he's going to try to take advantage of that with Steven's advice. And then, of course, we've got Rocket's Admin. This can be very useful in close games where essentially you want to put your opponent in a very low hand size, maybe put them off some cards. And then this is what I'm going to call one of the main, I don't know, say innovations, but this is one of the main, like when somebody looks at Yuta's list, the thing that's always going to stick out is those 4 Pokemon reversals. And it just provides a deck with so much utility. Some of the biggest decks at the time are going to be like LBS, and this is very easy for the deck to target down Blastoise EX. You're doing ×2 damage to it. It's super easy to take that one-hit knockout. Your opponent's building up a threat on the bench. Just reversal it up, take a one-hit knockout on it. And it also made it incredibly easy for the deck to knock out Pidgeot. A single Crush and Burn, discarding just 1 energy is going to be enough to do 50 damage, doubling to 100 to take that Pidgeot knockout. Now we play 4 Rare Candy here. This is because we do play 2 different Stage 2 lines. 4 copies of Hoenn Ruins. Now, Yuta knew that since he was not playing the Hoenn engine, he didn't really have a great way to discard energy for Dragonite or for the Metagross from Deoxys. So he knew he had to play Hoenn Ruins. Now, Yuta does play a relatively low supporter count. This Hoenn Ruins helps offset it a little bit as well. Not only does that give him an additional draw, it also gives him a way to discard either energy to get back with Dragonite or Metagross, or to discard cards that are no longer needed, like extra copies of Jirachi or things like that, to have a less chance of drawing into him off late game admins. Now, I also want to note, while other decks in the format can use this, and it can be awkward against certain decks like Bombtar, for example, will very commonly play the Delta Species Larvitar. That's not a deck you want to give the discards to. There's also quite a few decks in the format that just simply can't take advantage of this, like LBS or Mutrick, for example. 2 Pokemon Retriever. We rely so heavily on using that Metagross to attack. It is almost solely the attacker in the deck, or the main attacker in the deck. We want to be able to put those lines back in, and then force our opponent not to go through just 3 of the Delta Species Metagross, force them to go through 4, 5, or even 6 of them. For our switching cards here, we play 1 Switch, 1 Warp Point. Splitting the line, I think, in this deck is a perfectly fine idea. There is times where you just want to take cheap prizes off the bench with Warp Point, but there's also going to be times where you just want to hit that active Pokemon as well. Delta Control is going to let us burn through our deck so quickly. It is realistic to say in certain situations we would have both of them on our hand, and then we can make that decision. Energy line up here, we do go with a little bit thicker energy line. You got 10 Lightning, 4 Special Metals, and then 1 Psychic Energy. Since we are discarding our energy every single turn, not only do we have energy acceleration in the deck, but it puts a little bit more emphasis on getting that manual attachment every single turn. Also, if we're going to be using Hole in Ruins to help us set up, we also want to make sure that we have some good discards on there and that we're not pitching valuable cards. And then, I guess lastly, you just want to make sure that you have the right energy for the right situation. He did add that copy of Psychic Energy just so he could attack with Link Blast. You got to have those metal energies to reduce some of the damage to both Metagross and Dragonite, and then obviously the lightning energies to use for Delta Charge. Now, all in all, I'm going to say this is an incredibly solid deck list. But I do think you can make some good arguments for some things in here. I think one thing is Yuta is very low on supporters. I think you can make, he's got essentially, what is that? Essentially 9 supporters in the deck, only 5 draw supporters. Now, I think you can make some good arguments to play larger Steven's Advice, larger copycat counts, or even Rocket's Admin. The one Rocket's Admin fell back there. The one Rocket's Admin did throw me off a little bit because in a lot of matchups, you are going to target down that Pidgeot with Pokemon Reversal. So, being able to Pokemon Reversal up the Pidgeot, knock it out, and then Rocket's Admin them, especially in the mid or late game where they're getting maybe 3 or less cards, can be incredibly strong. And then in the early stages of the game, as decks rely more heavily on large benches, just that Steven's Advice for 4, 5, 6 cards can make setting up so much easier. Now, Yuta basically built the deck to hit that first Metagross and then set up from there, so he puts less emphasis on the supporters, but I do think you can make some arguments there. Another area is going to be your switching cards. The 1 Switch, 1 Warp Point I think is perfectly fine, but with so many control decks in the format, I think you could argue to up that to maybe a 3rd switching card as well. I think you do 2 Switch and a Warp Point. I think you can make some really good arguments for Fluffy Berry in this deck. And I also think you can make some really good arguments for Mr. Briny's Compassion. Not only would this get you out of any potential Houndoom shenanigans, but there's going to be a lot of decks in the format, like Mulok, for example, where if you do have a Jirachi in play, you're going to want to completely remove that from the board. Or it's going to be kind of a surprise tech for your opponent, where your opponent maybe thinks that you can't get out of a certain situation, and then you're going to be able to Brinies to get out of it where maybe you otherwise wouldn't be. So I think those are both good arguments. In the variation that I'm currently testing, I play a Mr. Briny's Compassion over the Warp Point, and then I also play 1 VS Seeker. Not only does this give me access to more copies of Admin, Stevens, Copycat, or even Celio's Network, it just is some really good utility and a little extra consistency for the deck. But all in all, I think Yuta's list is absolutely fantastic, and if you want to go with this variation of MetaNite, you should be playing this list within a couple of cards, kind of depending on what you're expecting for the meta and some personal preference in there as well. Now, as far as matchups go, MetaNite can be very difficult to discuss because essentially MetaNite does incredibly well against the best decks in the format. And what I mean by that is this is a deck that's going to play very well against LBS. It's going to play incredibly well against Powtar. it's going to play very well against a lot of different EX variations. But what this deck is going to struggle against is basically any sort of control deck. Decks like Mulok, for example, are going to be incredibly hard for this deck to beat. Mew Trick can be very, very hard for this deck to beat because the deck falls susceptible to a couple of different things. One, all your consistency and your energy attachment are partly metal. This makes the deck very vulnerable to Battle Frontier, and Battle Frontier is very heavy in this format, or can be very heavy in this format. The deck also is incredibly power heavy, so decks that take advantage of this, such as Rye Eggs, for example, can also be very challenging. The deck also relies very heavily on bench setters, for example, that don't necessarily have cheap retreats like the Dragonite. So different variations of POW control or POW lock, such as Mulok, like we talked about, or even the Metacham Houndoom deck we featured on the channel a couple of weeks ago, can put this deck in very awkward situations. This is, in my opinion, if you're playing MetaNite in a 2006 format, it is a big meta call. If you're expecting the format to be those tier 1, straightforward, I want to stand and throw punches with you type of decks, MetaNite is an outstanding play for that. If you're expecting a lot of these little sneaky control decks, MetaNite is absolutely not the deck that you should be playing in that format. You just really have to have a good pulse on what the format is and what you think it's going to be, and then how you want to approach that tournament or that game. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here.